All right, hi everyone. And welcome to Mindgasms. I am Andrew, aka Sexual Mindgasms, for the purposes of this video, and I'm going to talk about the essay by an evil postmodern Christian about a commentary on a larger essay called Theological Foundations for Understanding Human Sexuality. And this was written by Joan Heffelfinger, who is my mom, when she was in seminary. So I'm going to go into certain parts and comment on the parts that I think are most interesting or controversial. So let me just put up my thumbnail here and we will get into it. Here we go. All right. Okay. So this is an interesting little commentary on a larger essay called Theological Foundations for Understanding Human Sexuality. Okay. Definitions of theology as theory about the experience of God's loving touch, spirituality as the way to live faith, and spiritual growth as how much we allow God's expectations to shape and teach us were all very insightful for me. Often we use these terms without thinking what they mean. These definitions are clear and accurate. Yeah, I mean, um, I've said on my channel before, for example, I personally, I don't know, maybe I'd consider myself somewhat of an agnostic now. Whether I'm an agnostic or an agnostic atheist is open to interpretation. I call myself an agnostic atheist, but because I don't believe that any gods exist, but I don't claim to know whether any gods exist or not because I don't think that anyone knows, because I make a distinction between a knowledge claim and a belief claim. But I would be okay with someone labeling me as an agnostic. But either way, that's not these concepts of God's loving touch, spirituality, and spiritual growth don't mean that much to me because I'm not Christian. But anyway, let's get into the next paragraph here. Okay. We often dread prayer because in prayer we might meet God. Often I do not want to hear what I think God will tell me. For instance, I spend much time thinking about the arms race and our potential to destroy ourselves. But frequently I resist the temptation to pray about it because I think that God will tell me to get involved and to work toward changing the situation. That means commitment. That's interesting, I think, because, um, again, this doesn't mean that much to me from a theological perspective because I'm not Christian, but I think that's interesting. I've never come across that that attitude towards prayer before, being afraid of praying because God might demand something of us. Because I've always had this impression that when most people pray, at least in today's modern world, that they don't believe that God is actually talking to them, and they expect that God doesn't talk back to them or anything like that. But I think that's interesting about not wanting to pray because God would demand something of you. That sounds a little like more traditionalist or small c conservative of an interpretation of Christianity, but that's interesting too. And especially talking about the arms race because this was written in the 80s. That's when my mom was in seminary, about the arms race and the potential and our potential to destroy ourselves, as in the entire human species. And that obviously has a whole lot of implications for the survival of the human species, and theological ones if you're approaching it from uh, a Christian vantage point. I think that's interesting, though. Anyway, okay, next part. Radical love is the kind I have with Rob, my husband. We identify with each other, but allow each other to remain ourselves. I have a hard time with the wedding ceremony where the man and woman light 2 candles at the beginning and then together light a third but blow the other 2 out. That says that there are no longer 2 unique individuals here. Yeah, I think that's interesting because, there's this idea of how when you're married, there are two halves that become a whole, 2 parts that become one, and you are all one, like um, traditionally a man and a woman in marriage are one unity. But I like that you should still be your own individual people even if you're married. I think that approach makes more sense to me because, you can be in love with someone, but still have your own personality and, have a life that they're a part of, but you don't need to be the same people. You can be different, distinct people in one cooperative relationship. That makes sense to me. Okay, so next part here. I'm also excited by the potential of radical love. As the heart of spiritual sexuality, radical love can heal our self images. It is a holistic kind of love. That's interesting also because I like this idea of radical love, loving ourselves, it being holistic, and and it coming from the heart, which is which or it being the heart of spiritual sexuality, radical love being the heart of spiritual sexuality, which I think is interesting because it's uh, it's talking about how sex can be like a noble, holy, theological act because it's an act of love. Obviously, it's not always an act of love. It's often just an act of fun, and I think that it's just as legitimate to have sex for fun as it is for love. They're just different things and serve different purposes. But anyway, they're both good. And okay, so let's get into the next part here. I'm also I'm also excited by inspirited bodiliness as contrasted with the embodied spirit. Too often have we been told that the body is of a low realm and that we must stress spirituality at the expense of bodiliness. What a freeing concept. I really like that too because it 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 reminds me of this just stupid antiquated interpretation of Christianity, which actually is historically relatively recent, at least it being so mainstream as it is today. This idea of the body being low and to be looked down, something to be looked down upon, and the mind being superior and your intellect being superior, and that it should take precedence over your body. And it reminded me of, you know I've talked about this concept before of what I think is this dumb concept that has pervaded all of Western philosophy since the beginning, since ancient Greek philosophy, and even including the pre-Socratic philosophers, that this idea of dualism in philosophy of mind, that the mind and body are 2 separate entities and they are not the same thing, and the mind is superior to the body. So like I said, you should worship the mind and the intellect, but the body and bodily pleasures and sex are lowly and unholy, which is this just puritanical interpretation of Christianity. So I like that, this idea of inspirited bodiliness, appreciating your body and sexuality. I think that makes a lot of sense. All right, anyway, let's get into what I think, the last part that I highlighted and what I think is the most interesting part is human sexual intercourse God's design? I certainly agree that it was one of God's best plans and that God delights in our lovemaking. But what does the idea of sexual intercourse being God's design say for those who, for physical reasons, cannot have sexual intercourse? You could say that about asexual people too, those who are not attracted to anyone. It's a small number of people, but that's the same as people who, for physical reasons, cannot have sex, along with the other groups of people that my mom is about to mention. who for physical reasons cannot have sexual intercourse. What does that say to homosexual couples? Do we need to broaden our concepts of sexual intercourse? I think that's a good question. I would say that, if sexual intercourse is part of God's design, sexual intercourse with a gay couple is still sex. I don't think there's anything inherently different about that, other than it's not the act of procreation, which some idiots like Matt Walsh would say is the only thing that sex and marriage should be for, but he's fucking wrong about that. But anyway, like whether you're in a straight couple, a gay couple, you're lesbians or bisexuals or trans or whatever, I think that all just still qualifies as sexual intercourse, and you can have a broad definition of it. But yeah, I guess that isn't fair to, above all people, asexual people, or for people who, for physical reasons, can't have sex, like, people who have a spinal injury, or they had their legs amputated, or for some reason their dick doesn't work, or their vagina doesn't work, or something like that. Then I suppose you could see that it being interpreted as God seeing them as less divine. But, I don't know. That's a good question. Maybe they could bring others sexual pleasure. That would be a divine act if sexual intercourse is part of God's design. It's an interesting question. What do you think about that? Let me know in the comments. Does this definition of sex, if it doesn't include asexual people or disabled people or people who can't have sex for one reason or another, or don't have any sexual desires, what should that mean in terms of sex and how they have sex, especially if sex is actually this holy act, rather than this dirty, filthy, lowly one, as many old-fashioned traditional conservative Christians would say. Anyway, yeah, I wanted to get into this essay a bit because I thought it was really interesting. And yeah, like I said, let me know your comments. Let me know your thoughts about it, rather, in the comments. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Click that bell to be notified when I come out with new videos. I think I'm not sure what I'm going to do for my next solo one. I'm going to be talking about Dark Tower 4, Wizard and Glass, the sci-fi, the fantasy western horror sci-fi series by Stephen King. I'm going to be talking about that with my friend Dusty, so check that out as well. And for my next solo video, I'm either going to talk about Epictetus's The Art of Living, do another one on Slavoj Žižek's Less Than Nothing, or I might criticize another public intellectual for saying some dumb shit. Who knows? Let me know which you would prefer in the comments if you're watching this as well. All right, thanks again, everyone. And also, of course, check out my Patreon page. Link is in the description as always. Smash that like button. Share this everywhere. Share the Mindgasms all over the place. And yeah, most importantly, always remember this. The funk cures all. And groove is in the heart. And this idea of sexuality being part of God's design and this like divine act, I think is a way better and more interesting interpretation of Christianity than looking at the body and sexual pleasure as this lowly sinful thing to be looked down upon, that I've talked about in my series with Foucault's History of Sexuality, talking about how religion during the Enlightenment was one of the institutions that painted especially homosexuality and sex in general and anal sex and all kinds of other things to do with sex as being literally sinful. All right. Thanks again, everyone, and adios until next time.